Hello, I'm Mark O'Connor, and we're here today for a deeper dive into the concept of data monetization. This is coming out of our Tech Index report, which is a temperature check of the technology sector. And I'm delighted to be joined by two friends and colleagues who are experts in this field and can bring their insights. Anthony Lloyd, who leads our team in Sydney, Andrew Dyson, who leads our team in the UK. So guys, looking at the Tech Index report, I think it's fair to say there were some slightly surprising findings in terms of the uptake of data monetization amongst organizations. Anthony?
Absolutely. I think we're surprised to see that the levels are so low, I guess, because increasingly in a data-driven society, all businesses have data. From my perspective, I think it may be a bit of a misunderstanding of the question from our respondents, in that they see data monetization in a very narrow way, being an external focus of packaging up data and selling it, whereas, of course, the way in which we intended it to be viewed was two aspects, I suppose. One's the external focus of having some economic benefit from that data and being able to sell it, but the other is to having some business benefit, so whether or not that's informing the way you do processes or the way in which you're able to access better information about your customers, but it's monetising it in that sense that I think is the far more powerful side of things.
Andrew, the same for you and from your perspective in the UK?
Totally, and I think talking to clients on these points, this issue that Anthony's just alluded to, it comes up time and time again, that the real value in the data asset when they're building a warehouse, when they're ingesting large volumes of data into kind of big systems and looking at it is that internal focus, the MI, the BI that it's telling you about your operations and sales and your profiles of your customers, and that ability to innovate and drive value out of your product, value out of your customers, rather than, oh, we're going to package this up and spin it off into a company that intrinsically is going to have value in its own right. And I think there are examples of that. But I think they're sort of the icing on the cake, and that the real substance here is understand what's going on in the business with the sales. The Internet of Things concept, I mean, that's grabbing data, telling you real-time, large, important volumes of information about that product, where it's working well, where there may be inefficiencies, where you can improve the service timeline and do a better service to your customers or save money and so on. So that's what we're really talking about when we're looking at monetizing the data, actually using it in a more powerful way to improve the efficiency of your systems and drive better innovation.
So this is the key takeaway, or the added piece that's not coming out necessarily as strongly as we anticipated from the index, that we have got the traditional view of monetization, derived data, selling, packaging up data. And let's talk about use cases and maybe some of the challenges with that. But there's that bigger piece you're both describing. Perhaps we can talk about some examples of that I think the report talks about mining, talks about public sector, talks about aviation, of ways in which organizations can really dive into the information that's in their hands for business benefit. Is that fair, to bring those two angles together?
Absolutely. Andrew talked about the examples in manufacturing and sort of in engineering side of things. In the mining sector, that data is really being used. Monetisation is probably is the wrong term, because what it really is utilisation of that data. And so, for example, mining companies will analyse the performance of mining equipment and will be able to detect over a series of time where parts might fail on certain equipment, and they'll pre-order parts and have that stock on hand for when things go wrong, and sort of using that.
So smart sensor data to almost precog what's going wrong, so you don't have downtime. Drop it, no downtime.
Yeah,
no downtime.
Exactly. And the other examples we were sort of discussing earlier in relation to the aviation industry. Well, they're so rich in data that they're getting from travellers through frequent flyer programs. They've also got information about shopping habits and all sorts of things, and sort of utilising that to better be able to target products and services to those customers, or potentially even to share them with other companies or airlines even.
So this is sunny uplands of huge volumes of data that all organisations have got. Yet our index is, for whatever reason, as we've just discussed, maybe not showing that the exploitation is happening. But why are there barriers? That I've got customer data you've just described, sensor data. What's stopping me just packaging that up and making a ton of money out of it?
So one of the most obvious ones, and I think it is mentioned in the report, is the regime around protecting personal data processing, which in Europe we've got the GDPR, but it's all over the world now. We've got these regimes that say, look, if you're collecting personal data, and all the information we're talking about here, to the extent it relates to individuals, and this is different from the IoT piece that might be in an engineering B2B context, it's restricted and it's regulated, and you can't freely, I might have collected it for one purpose, but I cannot then repurpose it for something else that's unrelated unless I've gone through the whole cycle of checking I've been transparent with my customers about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and making sure there's a lawful basis for processing that data, which often means you have to get the permission or be confident that it's genuinely for a purpose that they're going to be comfortable with or otherwise legally permitted. So this is a barrier that often comes. So when you sit down with people and they have, as you talk about the rosy headlands of, what the nirvana of what could be potentially done with these great big data sets, and then you say, well, we've got these wonderful use cases, you immediately come to this hurdle which says, well, hold on a minute, it's personal data, right? So we now need to go back and do the checks and balances and see, can we do this? And very often, if you haven't, we talk about privacy by design, if you haven't built into the origin of the data collection privacy by design. So why am I collecting it? What might I want to do with it downstream? And how have I explained that and got the right permissions in place at the beginning and potentially tagged it along the way? You may have a potentially great data set, but it's no use to you from a lawful basis. You can't use it. So it's very important that that's a barrier. And I think that is alluded to in the report. But it shouldn't be a barrier that's insurmountable. It means with careful consideration, with proper governance and frameworks, when people are building these data warehouses, that they're actually thinking, what could the downstream purposes be? And build in the checks and balances and controls at the outset. It gives you the power to unlock that data downstream.
Because that remediation process to go back in time to get the right use to the data presumably kills the business case.
Very quick on that, I talk about pollution, right? Because if you've got data that's come in and you don't know where it's come in from, you don't know what permissions it's come with and consents and so on, it potentially pollutes the whole data set because you just haven't tagged it in the right way from the beginning.
Yeah. But also you got to think about the personal data side of things is also a narrow set of the data that we're talking about as well. I think boards should be looking as to what data do we have, what value is that to the company, how can we best use that data to improve how we make decisions or improve the way in which we provide services. So really have a strategy around that data and implementing it for the best uses of the company.
So the issues of privacy by design you've just described and better use cases for data downstream. But presumably this has piqued the interest of regulators now and potentially in the future. So from both your jurisdictions, between you, we circumnavigate the world here. What are you seeing down the track?
Well, in Australia, of course, the consumer data rights has been the big piece of legislation that's come in, progressively going through different industries, the first being the banking with open banking. And we're seeing the government realising that there should be some ownership in personal data and for the individual to be able to control that data. So first of all in banking, then moving across into the energy sectors, insurance and so on will follow. And so that's a really strong recognition that people should be able to take control of their information, their data, and be able to use that to move around different services, and they should be able to control that. But one of the things that comes out from that is I think that there's a real opportunity for certain companies to be able to get access to that data in terms of the open architecture which is there, and be able to provide holistic services. So for example, it might be that someone like an accounting package, you might use that, and then that accounting package might go and talk to the bank and get that information into your accounting package. It might also talk to your electricity provider and get you a better deal on that. And so all of a sudden you might have a one-stop shop, if you like, where one person deals with all of those things for you and they control all of that data from the different areas, but you only see one interaction with your accounting software, for example, and it then goes and gets a better deal for you at the bank, or it gets a better deal for you on your insurance or whatever it might be.
And that is a powerful example, isn't it? That's to what you both said earlier, just because you can, should you? That does sound like a should you example. Andrew, from your perspective, from the other side of the world, from the UK and Europe, what's happening?
Very similar themes. I mean, I think the journey starts with personal data and the things we were talking about before. And we have PSD2, which is open banking, and the data sharing that comes out of that. But we're now moving into the next sort of stage of this and looking at Europe's got the Data Act, which has a much broader concept than personal data. And it says, look, if a device is generating data and you own that device, you should have the ability to some extent to control that information and the exploitation or the monetization, if you like, of the data. Don't just assume if I've got a car and I'm driving it around and it's creating lots of valuable information. It's not just belonging to the manufacturer of that car. It's actually, I could choose to give it somewhere else, and I could choose to share it somewhere else and control it. So we talked about monetization, but the assumption there was monetization by the corporates. But actually, as you start to do that, you run into people getting concerned about, well, where's that? How am I controlling that value that I'm actually generating for the businesses? How am I making sure we're not getting into antitrust competitive practices? So this is where this legislation is starting to come from, which is quite interesting. So, I always see the scales always end up having to rebalance themselves. So we're starting to see that emerge, and who knows where it's going to go. We have concepts of data portability, for example, in the GDPR, not well exercised, but philosophically there's there for a reason. But I think those principles are now starting to emerge in this other legislation. So the public sector in many jurisdictions is 40-50% of the economic development that's going on in a country, and that's generating large volumes of data, and ultimately that belongs, if you like, to the public. So unlocking that, a bit like you go into a library and you can access books and it's for everyone's benefit, do the same thing with the data that's being generated by all the public sector departments and operations that are going on around the country, and let other people benefit from that, because ultimately we're the stakeholders in that community. So Europe's got the Data Governance Act, which attempts to do that. The UK, we've done something similar a number of years ago. Again, I think it's all very immature, and we will see whether some of these things are just nice philosophical ideas or they turn into something else. But if we're talking philosophical ideas, one thing that just to kind of mention at the very end, and it touches on something Anthony was saying, was we have this concept of data altruism. I don't know if you've come across this, but this is an idea that if people have more control over their data, it's not just about monetizing it for value, but actually I want to do good in society. I want to give my health information to a charity so that they can find the cure for cancer and bring those things together and monitor all these kind of aspects of my lifestyle, which at the moment are held by companies or mobile phone operators or device level. So unlocking the value not just for commercial benefit, but potentially for social good too, and us as individuals and consumers having the power to do that.
So we've kind of followed a nice arc here from narrow definition of data monetization, big co selling data, actually through to a much more user and citizen-centric piece, particularly with what you've both been saying there in terms of the individual owning their data, the individual having those rights, the greater good brought by an organisation like a government to exploit that for the benefit of its populace.
Might be interesting for us to maybe change the question in the next survey to data utilisation, perhaps, rather than monetisation.
I think that would be very wise.
Get a better feel for what people are actually doing, because if the results actually speak to people not utilising it, then there's this great untapped opportunity for many companies if they don't have a data strategy, or that they aren't properly utilising the data. I think that must be, there's a major thing that needs to be.
There's just one final thing I'd mention, because we talked about all the good things that could be done and the power of all of this, but there are some risks as well. The most obvious one for me is cyber risk. So if you are collecting large volumes of data and you are putting them into one central place, that's a gold mine, not just for you internally to kind of manage, but also for someone to come in and potentially destroy your business. So it's not without its risks to go down this route. And again, it's really critical that organisations are thinking about what we're trying to do here, what's necessary, what's proportionate, what are the controls that we're putting in place, and not just assuming it's just, as I say, grab as much as we can and put it in a single place, because at some point it might be useful to us. Even if you navigate all the legal piece, there are those wider risks of a threat actor gets into that, takes that data out, highly competitive information that could be used to destroy a business. And there are examples where that's happened. And these things just need to be thought through from that perspective as much as all the other things we've mentioned.
It's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because you could say that, for example, the data that a bank has about you is pretty well protected given the systems that they have in place, and they get 5 million hits a day and people trying to steal that information. If you then got the right to take that out and put it somewhere else potentially that isn't as well protected, then that is a major concern for everyone. But particularly for you, you've finally got hold of your data, and then you've made it more vulnerable.
And I did see in other parts of the survey, one of the top, I think it was consistently the top risk from a board point of view was security, wasn't it? I mean, that was the thing that people were saying when we're looking at innovation. The top thing that we're looking at when we're making that decision whether to proceed or not is, have we covered off the security issues? Because that's a constant refrain, isn't it?
Fantastic. So I think our takeaways here are data monetization is just a sliver, a piece of the story. Data utilization is the top level term we should be using here, but not in isolation. As you've both been saying, there is regulation coming around the corner, and it's a business and consumer issue in terms of the right checks and balances and guardrails that look after this. Anthony, Andrew, fantastic. I know we've only just skated on the surface here of the sorts of issues we can get into, but I hope for our readers and those looking at the Tech Index, you've been inspired to look in a more detailed way at the data monetization piece. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks.